You have the decent salary, the nice car, and the mortgage is under control. On paper, you've made it. But why does it feel like you're still just 1 or 2 paychecks away from a total meltdown? There is an invisible trap designed specifically for those who finally reach the middle class, and the more you earn, the tighter it gets. Today, I'm going to show you how to identify this wealth trap and, more importantly, how to escape it before your peak earning years are gone. My name is Ely, and I spend way too much time thinking about how people in the US experience money psychologically. If you're someone who earns a normal income, maybe even more than you used to, but still doesn't feel financially secure, hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Because what I'm about to walk through is something most financial channels completely ignore, and it might be the most important money conversation you have all year. Let's start with something that might sting a little. The median household income in the United States sits around $74,000 a year, according to the US Census Bureau. That number sounds reasonable. Sounds like enough. And for a lot of people, it should be. But here's the thing. A 2023 survey by the American Psychological Association found that money remains the #1 source of stress for Americans, ahead of health, relationships, and work combined. Not for people making $30,000. For people making $60,000, $80,000, $100,000. The stress doesn't go away when the income goes up. That's the first clue that something deeper is going on. So what exactly is the wealth trap? It's not about being broke. It's about the specific psychological and financial dynamic that catches people right in the middle. People who earn enough to feel like they should be fine, but not enough to actually feel safe. And the cruel part is that it's almost perfectly designed to feel invisible until it's already cost you years of financial progress. Here's how it starts. Someone grows up in a household where money was tight. Maybe not poverty-level tight, but tight enough that a broken-down car or an unexpected medical bill was a genuine crisis. That experience gets wired into the nervous system. Financial stress in childhood and early adulthood leaves a psychological imprint that researchers call a scarcity mindset, the brain's default assumption that resources are limited and can disappear at any time. Now that same person grows up, lands a decent job, starts pulling in $65,000 or $70,000 a year. By every objective measure, they're doing better than they ever have. But the nervous system doesn't update automatically. The brain is still running old software. It still interprets financial decisions through the lens of scarcity, even when the actual numbers no longer justify that level of alarm. That internal conflict between the reality of the bank account and the feeling of financial danger is where the trap starts to form. Now you might be thinking, okay, but that's just about feelings. The real problem is the numbers, right? People just spend too much. And that's partly true. But here's what most people don't realize. Behavior follows psychology, not the other way around. The spending patterns that keep middle-class Americans financially stuck aren't random. They're predictable psychological responses to very specific emotional pressures. Take lifestyle inflation. Someone gets a raise. Their income jumps from $60,000 to $75,000. That's a meaningful increase, an extra $1,250 a month before taxes. Most people feel genuinely excited. And then, almost without thinking, the spending adjusts. The apartment upgrade happens. The car lease gets more ambitious. The dinner budget quietly grows. Subscriptions accumulate. The clothing budget shifts. By the time 6 months pass, that $1,250 is completely absorbed. And the feeling of financial stress is exactly the same as before, maybe even slightly worse because the new baseline costs more to maintain. This is called hedonic adaptation, and it is one of the most well-documented phenomena in behavioral economics. The human brain is wired to normalize new circumstances rapidly. What felt like luxury becomes the new floor, and once it becomes the floor, losing it feels like a genuine threat. So the person doesn't just spend more. They now feel they need more, because anything less than the current lifestyle registers psychologically as a step backward, even if it would have felt perfectly fine 18 months ago. Here's the math on that. The average American household spends roughly $61,000 a year according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey. That's the average, not the extravagant, not the irresponsible. The average. Housing alone accounts for about $22,000 of that. Transportation runs another $10,000. Food is around $9,000. Healthcare is close to $6,000. And we haven't touched childcare, student loans, insurance, clothing, or the phone bill. When the income is $74,000 and the average expenditure is $61,000, what's left is $13,000 before taxes are fully accounted for. That's not a comfortable cushion. That's a tight wire. And this is where it gets interesting, because the stress people feel isn't irrational. It's actually a fairly accurate read of a genuinely fragile situation. The Federal Reserve's report on the economic well-being of U.S. households consistently finds that roughly 37% of Americans couldn't cover a $400 emergency without borrowing money or selling something. Not people in poverty. People with jobs, cars, leases, and subscriptions. People who, by their own description, consider themselves middle class. So the feeling of being one paycheck away from crisis? For a significant chunk of the middle class, that's not anxiety distorting reality. That's anxiety correctly reading it. But here's the trap within the trap. Because the solution most people reach for, the one that feels logical and even necessary, actually makes the problem worse. When the financial stress is chronic, when the margin is thin, when the paycheck disappears 2 days after it arrives, people don't tend to respond by cutting back and building reserves. They respond by seeking relief. And in American consumer culture, relief is available 24 hours a day in one-click checkout format with free 2-day shipping. This isn't a character flaw. It's neuroscience. Chronic financial stress activates the same threat response systems in the brain as physical danger. And when the brain perceives ongoing threat, it prioritizes immediate relief over long-term planning. This is why a person who genuinely knows they should be saving money will still stop at a restaurant on the way home from a brutal work week. It's not stupidity. It's the nervous system seeking a moment of control and comfort in an environment where both feel scarce. The psychologist Abraham Maslow mapped out a hierarchy of needs that most people have seen in a textbook. What's less discussed is how financial insecurity, even moderate financial insecurity, keeps the brain locked in the lower levels of that hierarchy, safety and security, making it genuinely harder to think clearly about the future. Long-term planning, delayed gratification, strategic thinking. These are functions of the prefrontal cortex, the rational, forward-looking part of the brain. Chronic stress suppresses prefrontal activity. In other words, financial anxiety doesn't just feel bad. It literally impairs the cognitive functions most needed to solve financial problems. This is why telling a financially stressed person to simply make a budget and stick to it is almost comically insufficient. The advice isn't wrong exactly. Budgets matter. But delivering that advice without addressing the psychological environment is like telling someone with a broken leg to run faster. The mechanism needed to execute the advice is the exact mechanism being compromised by the problem itself. Now look, there's another layer to this, and it's one that almost nobody wants to talk about because it involves something deeply uncomfortable: social comparison. The United States is one of the most status-conscious societies on the planet. Not in an aristocracy kind of way, in a visible, everyday, consumer culture kind of way. The car in the driveway, the neighborhood, the school district, the vacation photos, the kitchen renovation. These aren't just personal choices. They're social signals. And in a culture where worth is quietly but constantly measured by visible consumption, opting out of those signals doesn't feel neutral. It feels like failure. The economist Thorstein Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption over 100 years ago to describe the way people use spending to signal status. What he probably didn't anticipate was social media, a technological system that essentially gamifies status comparison at scale, 24 hours a day, across every income level. When the reference group is no longer the neighbors on the block, but everyone anyone has ever known, plus influencers, plus algorithm-curated aspirational content, the pressure to spend in status-affirming ways becomes relentless. And here's the specific damage that does to the middle class. The spending required to maintain a credible middle-class appearance has inflated dramatically over the past 2 decades, while the income gains have not kept pace. A 2022 report from the Brookings Institution noted that the costs of the core middle-class lifestyle, homeownership, healthcare, education, transportation, have grown significantly faster than median wages over the past 30 years. So people aren't just spending on luxury. They're spending to maintain what used to be considered a basic, respectable middle-class life, and it costs more in real terms than it ever has. So the wealth trap is this. The income rises, but the cost of maintaining the expected lifestyle rises faster. The psychological pressure to maintain appearances is constant. The scarcity wiring from earlier life makes it hard to feel secure even when the numbers are technically okay. The stress response impairs the exact thinking needed to plan a way out. And every raise, every promotion, every step forward gets swallowed by the expanding floor of what now feels like the minimum acceptable life. Now you might be thinking, this sounds like the answer is just spend less and save more. And again, that's not wrong. But before behavior can change sustainably, the psychological foundation has to shift. Because behavior that isn't supported by a genuine change in values and identity tends to revert under pressure. And middle-class life in America applies a lot of pressure. So what does an actual path out of this look like? The first thing, and this is harder than it sounds, is to clearly identify the threshold. Not the income threshold, the psychological one. What is the actual number that would make the financial situation genuinely stable? Not comfortable in a lifestyle inflation way. Stable. 3 to 6 months of essential expenses and liquid savings. High-interest debt zeroed out. Basic insurance coverage that wouldn't leave the household financially destroyed by a medical event. That's the floor. And for most middle-class households, getting there requires a deliberate, temporary decision to stop letting income increases automatically translate into lifestyle increases. The behavioral science term for this is a spending freeze on upgrades. Not a deprivation exercise, a redirection. The next raise doesn't go into a nicer apartment. It goes into the gap. The next bonus doesn't go into a weekend trip. It closes the distance to the threshold. And the psychological framing matters enormously here. This isn't sacrifice. This is the construction of the actual safety floor that the brain has been desperately searching for since childhood. Building real financial margin is the most direct route to reducing the chronic stress that's been driving the compensatory spending in the first place. The second thing is to audit the comparison pool. Not forever, not with moral judgment, just as a practical exercise. Whose spending is being used as a reference point? Friends, family, colleagues, social media accounts? What is the actual income and financial situation of those people? In many cases, the people being unconsciously benchmarked against are either in more debt than they appear, or are in genuinely different financial circumstances that make direct comparison meaningless. Narrowing the comparison pool to people with similar real financial situations, or removing it from the equation entirely for a defined period, dramatically reduces the psychological pressure to spend for appearance. Third, and this is subtle but powerful, start associating identity with financial margin rather than financial appearance. This is a genuine rewiring project, and it takes time. But every culture has language for it. Frugality, intentionality, financial independence, the vocabulary is there. The goal is to shift the internal story from, I am someone who can afford nice things, to, I am someone who builds real security. Those two identities lead to completely different spending behaviors in the face of discretionary income. And only one of them actually reduces the underlying stress. Fourth, get concrete about the real costs. Not in a punishing way, but in a clarifying way. Write down what financial safety actually costs in dollar terms. The emergency fund target, the debt payoff number, the retirement contribution needed per month to hit a reasonable trajectory. A lot of people avoid this exercise because the numbers feel overwhelming. But staying vague about the numbers doesn't make them smaller. It just keeps the anxiety diffuse and unactionable. When the target is specific, say $12,000 in liquid emergency savings, the brain can orient toward it. Progress becomes visible. The finish line exists. And fifth, slow down the automatic upgrade reflex. The research on hedonic adaptation shows that the happiness boost from lifestyle upgrades is real, but it's short-lived. The elevated baseline, however, is permanent until deliberately reversed. Before any significant spending increase, a new lease, a renovation, a car upgrade, build in a 30-day waiting period. Not because the purchase is necessarily wrong, but because it forces the decision out of the automatic stress relief response and into conscious, values-aligned choice. Purchases made deliberately feel different, and they don't tend to generate the guilt and financial anxiety that impulsive upgrades do. Here's what all of this comes down to. The wealth trap is real, it's documented, it's widespread, and it has very little to do with intelligence or ambition. It's the entirely predictable result of putting psychologically normal human beings into a financial and cultural environment specifically designed to consume surplus income as fast as it's generated. Recognizing the trap is not the same as escaping it, but it is the necessary first step. Because a trap you can see, you can navigate. The goal isn't to live small. It isn't to feel guilty about wanting things, or to pretend that money doesn't matter, or to adopt some extreme philosophy about minimalism. The goal is to stop letting the financial pressure be chronic, invisible, and managed through consumption. The goal is to build the actual floor, the margin, the buffer, the real safety that transforms financial security from a feeling that requires constant expensive maintenance into a reality that actually exists in the numbers. That shift changes everything, not just the bank account, the stress level, the decisions, the clarity, the relationships, the way the next raise feels, not like an opportunity to upgrade the lifestyle, but like a chance to genuinely advance towards something real. That's it for today. If this hit close to home, drop a comment below and tell me where in this pattern you recognized yourself. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.